All right. Let's do this. Well, thank you. This is my first talk to your group. Somebody from your group apparently read some of the work that I did and reached out to me and contacted me and said, hey, you should give a talk in front of our group. And I'm like, okay, where are you going to be? Right down the road in Syracuse. So here I am. And what I want to talk to you for the next 25 minutes or so is some cutting edge research that I'm carrying out in my lab right now that actually impinges on what a lot of you are interested in nut trees and mast taxa, because this is something that is kind of my bailiwick, which is looking at the history of forests in the Northeast and the Great Lakes region. And I'm not a nut guy, okay? What I am is I'm a mud guy. And what I do is I spend my time as a paleoecologist. I'm somebody who is trained to essentially look in the past to try and reconstruct, understand, and give some type of interpretation into the way in which the natural world used to be. So I'm a paleoecologist who is very much interested in understanding how did the forests and the environments, the landscapes here in the Northeast and Great Lakes, how did they take shape over thousands and thousands of years since the end of the last ice age, 11,700 years ago? So specifically, this means I study a period of time called the Quaternary period, and we are in a portion of that since the end of the last ice age, the Holocene epoch. So my research focuses essentially on the last 20 to 30,000 years of environmental history here in the Northeast and Great Lakes region. And one of the things that I do, it's my stock and trade, is that I work with mud that I collect from lots of different sources: lakes, wetlands, river floodplains, even some caves occasionally I've cored and retrieved sediments from. And I use these things called proxies, these biotic and abiotic indicators that we can use to help reconstruct environmental history. And one of the things that I'm trained in is pollen analysis. Right? And pollen has been utilized for decades throughout the Northern Hemisphere to reconstruct changes in vegetation, environmental, and climate conditions. And I retrieve and study these pollen grains from a variety of cores that I extract from lakes and wetlands where they accumulate, again, as part of the science of palynology, which is what I am. I'm a palynologist. And I use those changes in the frequencies of different pollen grains that I find in these sediments to record changes in vegetation communities and different species and their climatic and environmental conditions over time. So we're trying to reconstruct a bunch of different things, looking at changes in vegetation, looking at change in climate conditions, maybe changes in soil formation processes, lots of different things that we can use these changes in the pollen grains that we find in these sediment cores. And because of the fact that virtually all the tree species that I identify in these cores are ones that still exist today in the forests in our region, we can make these inferences about how climate and environment might have changed by looking at the conditions under which these species grow at the present time and making interpretations about how conditions might have changed, or in some cases stayed the same, through thousands and thousands of years. So pollen accumulating in lakes and wetlands, there's this constant rain of pollen that falls on the surface of many lakes and wetlands. On lake surfaces, the pollen grains will settle through the water column, settling on the floor of the lakes and accumulating with other sediments in these nice layers that you can see here through time. And what I do is I go out with my students and colleagues and I core these lakes and wetlands to retrieve these sediments and to analyze them for pollen, as well as other types of proxies that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is the gist of what I do. And I've got a team of graduate students in the Department of Anthropology and the Department of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo, who are my field crew. And I'm also advising some of these students with their master's theses and dissertation projects. And so what we've been doing since about the end of April this year is that we've been going out and we've been coring sediments from a variety of different lakes and wetlands here in upstate New York as part of a research project that I'm working on. Yeah, because I remember this too, just in a little aside. When I was an undergraduate and finishing up my degree in geology, I told my geochemistry professor, I said, you know, I want to go and study pollen. And he just looked at me with this look of just absolute pity on his face. It was like, Albert, why the hell would you want to do that? It's the most boring thing in the world. I said, well, you know, it's more exciting than doing titrations, as far as I'm concerned. Because when you get to go out in the field and not be a lab rat all the time, you know, you're working with cores that we extract, and you can see, you know, that you've got all different types of sediment textures and lithologies and colors. These are attesting to complicated changes in past environments that I'm eager to interpret in terms of how they relate to forest composition and climate change. And I do this work in my lab at the University of Buffalo, Quaternary Paleoecology and Pollen Analysis Laboratory. I call it the QUIPL for short, where my students and I do our research. And one of the things that I learned very quickly as a grad student, learning the art of pollen analysis, is that you use a lot of nasty chemicals to process the sediments. So we're using things like hydrofluoric acid in large quantities in order to dissolve things like sand grains. So there is an element of danger to it, which I'm kind of attracted to. You know, so much for being a boring line of research. We get to work with dangerous chemicals. And at the end of the day, these are some photographs from some cores that I've sampled over the years. You can see that we have lots of different types of pollen grains that we're able to identify because of their unique morphologies. So in general, what we can do is we can group these pollen into specific genera. Typically, it's the genus level we're looking at. So unfortunately, we may find an oak pollen grain, but we can't tell if it's a white oak or a northern red oak or a scarlet oak, unfortunately. We just have to lump it into the category of oak and be content with that. But one of the things that I like about being a paleoecologist is that we have a long tradition of data sharing. And I don't know if anyone has ever heard of this or used this online database. It's called Neotoma, named after the pack rats, obviously. And Neotoma is this accessible database of paleoecological data, including pollen data from all over the world. It's really a remarkable assemblage of paleoecological information. Just here in the northeastern part of the United States and adjacent Canada, you can see all those purple dots. Those are pollen sites. Okay, lakes and wetlands that have been cored and analyzed over many decades. So we have a pretty dense network of pollen data that have been made freely available to us by researchers like me who want to share their data. Now it's kind of interesting too when you look at this, and here we are in central New York. It's kind of we're in a dead zone for pollen analysis, unfortunately, but hopefully this is something that I and my students can hopefully fill in this gap in terms of creating more data sets that can give us some information about what specifically might be going on here in central New York, as well as other parts of the region. So you can download these data. You can do all types of interesting things like making pollen diagrams so that you can see the changes in the pollen taxa through time, which is something that's of interest to me because I'm interested in environmental and climate change. So as part of a project, this is a kind of a small project that I'm working on and hopefully get a manuscript out the door before the end of the year. What I've been doing is using not only the pollen data that I've generated from different sites, but also pollen data from this Neotoma database in order to kind of try and tell a story about vegetation and environmental change. So for example, here in New York State, we can look at modern pollen data for different types of forest taxa, everything from walnut trees, right, juglans, to hickory, carya, castanea, looking at geographically where we find the pollen of those species in the greatest concentrations. And these can be used, as we're finding out, to make inferences about those species and those taxas' preferences, environmental preferences related to climate, related to soils, other factors. So this is very interesting stuff. And you can imagine how difficult this would be to do if you didn't have access to other people's data that they generously share. And what we can do is that we can create not just time slices of what types of plants were growing on a landscape by looking at the pollen, we can merge those individual time slices together to create these moving pictures of how specific species, including hickories and oaks and chestnuts and other types of forest species, have changed in terms of their frequency and distribution since the end of the last ice age. That's what these little illustrations are showing you. Each species, each genus is different in terms of where they are, how frequent they are in particular types of pollen diagrams, and we can then interpret these moving pictures that we create to maybe say something, hopefully say something that's intelligent about the past and environmental change. And maybe in some instances to make some predictions about the future, which is something that we're all interested in the face of anthropogenic climate change, right? So this project that I'm working on is looking at pollen diagrams from all of these sites that you see here, these black circles. These are 76 sites that I've been able to acquire data for the lower Great Lakes and the interior Northeast. There are other sites that we're going to be adding to this, so we're not done yet in terms of adding sites to our database. And what we're doing is we're taking the existing chronologies from these sites, some are better than others, and we are essentially creating newer chronologies using statistical techniques that will give us a better idea of when these vegetational changes occurred through time. And what we do then is that we're doing something different. Is that what we're doing is that we're grouping these pollen of these different species. These are all major forest taxa that exist here in the Northeastern Great Lakes. We're grouping them into one of two categories, pyrophilic and pyrophobic. Now, you're a seasoned group of people, so I'm sure everyone knows what these terms mean. Okay? Pyrophilic, okay? Those species that have ecophysiological adaptations to fire and drought. Okay? And many of these pyrophilic, fire-tolerant species are mast taxa, things like oaks and hickories and chestnuts, and, for example, black walnut. Okay? So what we're doing is we're classifying these particular species into this one group of fire and drought-tolerant taxa, and we're comparing them against the frequencies of tree species which are the opposite. They abhor fire. Things like maple and birch and beech and ash, for example, and basswood. And this type of research has been pioneered by some people from Penn State. You probably heard of maybe Mark Abrams, forest ecologist, and his former PhD student, Greg Nowacki, who actually just gave a talk at UB, where I teach a couple of months ago. Very interesting talk. And what they postulate in a paper that was published many, many years ago, back in 2008, is that the forests in the northeastern United States are essentially being taken over by fire-intolerant species, like the maples and ashes and black cherry, since Euro-American and Euro-Canadian settlement, beginning in the 1700s. And they attribute this to the cessation of Native American fire and other more recent Euro-American and Euro-Canadian land use practices that have excluded fire from the forest. So we see this successional trajectory taking place where the oaks and hickories tend to be becoming less common, and the fire-intolerant species are becoming more prevalent in the forest. They call this process mesification. So nobody had applied this to pollen data. They're just using historical and modern forest survey data to look at these trends. And so I thought, well, why don't we look at this back in time using pollen? And maybe we can see what is happening, and maybe we can refine this initial hypothesis about how forests have changed within the last 2 to 3 centuries. And what you're seeing here in this map is the distribution of fire-tolerant pollen taxa in the Northeast and the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And the red colors indicate that you tend to find the pollen grains of things like oaks and hickories and other mast taxa in greater frequencies the further south you go. Seems to make sense, since many of these are warm-adapted tree species. So the southern Appalachians, the Ohio River Valley seems to be sort of a locus for where these types of tree species are found in their greatest abundances in our area. Notice that where we are in the interior Northeast, this is a place where we tend to have relatively lower frequencies of the pollen of these fire-tolerant species being found in the lakes and wetland sediments that we court today. So we see the geography at the present time, but what was the geography like going back 1,000 years, or 5,000, or 10,000 years? Was it the same or was it different? And if it was different, what were the factors that were modulating this change through time? So with this database of pollen data from 76 regional sites, what we've been able to find is kind of interesting. If you look over here on the left, what you see here is that the frequency of those fire-tolerant taxa, like the chestnuts and the hickories and the oaks, goes through this cycle every, it's like 1,000 to 1,500 years or so, where they increase and they decrease. In some periods of time, it's not quite as pronounced, but in other periods of time, especially in the last 6,000 years, you can see we have some big transitions between the fire-intolerant species like the maples and the beeches and the ash trees and the fire-tolerant ones. Now, nobody had seen this before, so we're right at the cutting edge of showing that there is this response that we can see when we look at pollen in this way, in terms of fire tolerance, that there is something that is going on, and it's kind of got this quasi-cyclic thing to it over thousands and thousands of years. And when we take this data, these data, and we create these moving pictures of how those frequencies have changed, the red colors mean we have greater frequencies of these fire-tolerant taxa that we're finding in these lake and wetland sediments. You can see there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity involved here. Okay, in certain places, in certain times, you can see that fire-tolerant taxa become quite common. In other places where they're actually relatively stable or they're decreasing. So it depends on where you are in the region different times. But we have distinct periods of time where they're increasing or they're decreasing. And we're still trying to interpret what the significance of these changes means. If you notice when you look at this animated GIF, sometimes you have this red wave that spreads from the lower peninsula of Michigan, and it seems to travel to the north and east over a period of about 400 to 500 years, like in this one. Michigan's hot while the rest of the region is cool. So you see these out-of-phase transitions, and we're interested to know, well, why is it that places like Michigan oftentimes are the first to experience this increase in these fire-tolerant mast taxa, while the Northeast has to wait 400, 500, 600 years to receive that wave and that change in forest composition. So this is one of the things that we're looking at. So we know that we have change occurring in a quasi-cyclical pattern, may not be sure why at this point, and we see that there's some spatial variation. So trying to explain these in terms of environmental or climatic processes is the challenge that we're facing right now. But we think we're onto something because of what it is that we're seeing in our data. So one of the things in order to address the whys of what it is we're seeing, I'm working on a bigger research project that's kind of spun out of this smaller pollen-based project. And it's one that involves an intense program of coring lakes and wetlands across upstate New York. I also have a couple of sites in Pennsylvania and a couple in Michigan, just for completeness' sake. But it's anchored here in upstate New York. And we have over 30 sites that we've been frantically coring since February, actually, which is one of the good things about anthropogenic climate change. You can get out in the field earlier. Yeah.
Way to be an optimist.
Yeah, you know, you gotta look at the silver lining, right? So, you know, you're not able to do winter coring, you know, on a frozen lake anymore, but you can do other types of things. And so what we're doing is we're retrieving all different types of sediments. This is awesome stuff right here. This is from a site I just cored 3 weeks ago. And what you can see is that you've got 60 centimeters of sand sitting on top of 40 centimeters of peat. That peat actually goes down several meters. But this is some kind of erosional event that happened. So this is real interesting stuff. And each site is different. So when you just think, oh, you're just going in the mud, hanging out in the swamps, all mud is different. Okay? You can see. My students say when they first are, you know, looking at this, oh, it looks like turds. I'm like, yeah, but you know what? This is good turds. This is stuff that's going to tell you about environmental history, climate change. These are things that you should be interested in. We should all be interested in. And what I'm doing, instead of looking at pollen right now, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the magnetism in these sediments using this interesting equipment that basically allows us to figure out how much soil material has been incorporated into these peat cores that we're looking at. And what that can tell us about is something like erosion. So when you find these magnetic signals in your peat cores, that might say something about, well, there was probably some periods of intense erosion that occurred over time. And maybe those soil particles are getting into those lake and wetland cores when the climate's a little bit wetter and maybe a little bit stormier, and there's more runoff that is creating enhanced erosion. This is the conceptual model that we're working with. And when you don't see those peaks in those magnetic values, this is when the landscape is more stable and the climate is probably drier. So this is the idea that we're working with. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of variability in these cores. Some of them are shorter than other ones, okay? They're not all made equal. Some of them are just like 30 centimeters of peat on top of glacial sediments. But others are actually quite long and have really interesting records. And what they show us is that we have these repeated peaks and valleys of high magnetic signals followed by low magnetic signals. This is a record that goes back 9,500 years all the way to the present time. So we have decent evidence from many of these cores of cyclic climate change that's impacted the Northeast and the Great Lakes ever since the end of the last ice age. It's remarkable what we're seeing. And most of the longest and deepest sites that we've been working at are showing these similar patterns. And the radiocarbon dates suggest that they're happening at more or less the same time. So this is something that, you know, completely blew me out of the water. I was not expecting to find this. And what I wasn't really expecting to find was that not only am I picking up this climate signal in, you know, swamps and bogs that people don't even think twice about, is that they actually match up over time with signals from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. These things called bond events that are interpreted as periods of cold climate. Now think about that for a minute, people. Climate change recorded in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on the seafloor, in those seafloor sediments, lines up very well with the changes that we're seeing here in upstate New York. What are the chances of that? Okay, another one of these mind-exploding moments. How do we interpret this? Well, we're still working on this. But one of the things that we can see when we go back to those data, let's not forget about the nut trees, okay? Because I know you want to hear about the nuts, okay? Yeah, you want to hear about the nuts. Those nut trees apparently become more common during those periods when the climate is, wow, warmer and drier. So this is something really cool. This is something that we're going to be pursuing, hopefully for a number of years as we try to work out what's going on. Get more cores, date them, do more types of multi-proxy studies using the pollen and other types of things, and then figure out how people were involved in this too, because that's another thing. I teach in an anthropology department. I'm interested in how people in the past were impacted by this. So there's a lot of really, really interesting things we're doing in our lab. And hopefully if you guys invite me back sometime in the future, I can give you updates about some of the things we're finding. Sound good? Questions, comments?
Are there other potential causes that you've hypothesized for this like high magnetic period?
Yeah,
Other than just one drive, could it be different management?
there's also, we see that in some cores, especially those that are located in areas that had high population densities of Native American settlements, especially during the last 1,000 years, agricultural late woodland period, we can see that some of those magnetic signals are actually stronger than they are in places where we don't have the evidence, the archaeological evidence for Native American settlements. So there's an anthropogenic signal,
Wow.
I think, for at least the last 1,000 years. And I would be really interested to find out if there is an anthropogenic signal even further back in time than that. Was it just limited to when indigenous peoples, adopted maize agriculture and had to clear forests and accelerate erosion? Is this something we can see going back, 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 years? So being able to try and tease apart that really complex, anthropogenic signal from the climate signal, which seems to be driving those patterns that are happening at, scales of 500 to 1,000 years. That's not an anthropogenic signal. That's definitely a climate signal, and I think that the erosional hypothesis, as I'm calling it, is probably the most viable one, but there are still other things that we have to account for too, to explain some of the things that we're seeing.
So on that front, do you have colleagues in Asia or Australia that are saying, hey, we could look at this?
I got to publish my stuff first. And yeah, I've already got some funding, and I'm applying for an even bigger grant to help fund this. And what I want to do is actually expand the geographic scope of this to all of Eastern North America at some point. To look at the changes that we see, not just here in the Northeastern Great Lakes, but maybe all of Eastern North America. And then if there are people, with the expertise to look at the different types of pollen and other proxies in other parts of the world, do they see similar things? And how do these relate to the broader patterns of climate change that seem to be driving a lot of these changes in these tree species through time? Yeah.
Do you see differences in the pollen record between wind-pollinated and insect-pollinated?
Yeah, if you're looking for certain types of tree species, like for example, black cherry, early successional tree, you can see lots of black cherry in the forests around here. You find very little, if any, of it in these pollen records because it's an entomophilous species. So it's insect pollinated, it's not anemophilous. So the ones like oak and pine, they produce so much pollen, they swamp out the pollen signals of other taxa that don't produce pollen in quite the same quantity. So you have to make allowances for the species that produce way too much versus the ones that produce way too little to try and arrive at some type of approximation.
Will you, two things real quickly. Can you tell where we are in the spike in the 1,500 years?
Yeah,
And the other thing is, will you be creating a methodology so other land-grant universities could do exactly the same kind of research?
Yeah. What I'm really finding, and that's a really excellent point, is that using this magnetic technique, and this technique has been used by other researchers to look at other types of questions, but not specifically for what I'm looking at in the types of sediments. It seems to be a really good, fairly good, I should say, chronological and correlational tool. Because if you can line up those peaks, and you do this the minute you get the cores out of the wetlands, you can create these curves, and you can verify those with the radiocarbon dates that you extract from those cores. And in most instances, those peaks and valleys, they line up with each other at all of these different sites, which is real exciting. So there's potential to use it in that way as a chronostratigraphic tool. And geologists would probably be, interested in those applications of it.
Are you able to see any evidence in your cores for like a fire event such as that?
Oh yeah, Yeah, depending on where you are, you can find lots of charcoal, especially in the last 1,000 years, and that seems to correlate pretty well with the advent of Three Sisters agriculture in the region. So when indigenous peoples, Iroquoians more specifically, begin to adopt maize-based agriculture, you can see not only that there are enhanced signals of erosion, you also get way more charcoal particles that you find in these sediment cores than in previous periods of time. So the impact that humans were having was definitely to amplify those fire regimes, which may have increased a little bit during the past, but we simply don't see the charcoal evidence as strongly as we do within the last 1,000 years.
One more question.
Way in the back.
With the changing climate, people are wondering the rate in which species may be migrating north. And since you're tracking, since the ice age preceded, you ought to be able to also be tracking how species migrated north as the climate warmed.
Could you summarize the question?
Basically, what he's asking is, what do we see in terms of the geography of these range shifts, north-south? What we're finding, and I think you can see that from that animated GIF, is that, you've actually got like this thing coming from the south and west, throughout the Holocene. Maybe at the end of the last ice age, you see those northerly shifts from south to north as the ice retreats and the climate ameliorates and becomes warmer. But during the Holocene, you tend to see this shift going from the southwest, the upper Great Lakes, to the northeast and back again. So the geography of that expansion is kind of interesting, and we're interested in that because if you think about it, if you've got all these different cyclic pulses of when certain types of trees are favored over others, you're going to create all these interesting biogeographic corridors where you're allowing species to expand into particular areas at certain times and other periods of time when those avenues are cut off. So there's a biogeographic story there too that hopefully we can elucidate in greater detail.